Lauren Jacobs, a 33-year-old widow, lived in the quiet town of Greenville, Mississippi. Greenville was a small, unassuming place, known for its old cotton mills and a dwindling population. The community was tight-knit, with a history rooted in working-class families and generations of African-American residents. It was in this backdrop that Lauren found herself grappling with the weight of loss and financial strain after the sudden death of her husband, David Jacobs, in a car accident 3 years prior. David's death had been a devastating blow. He had been the family's primary breadwinner, working as a truck driver, while Lauren focused on raising their daughter, Mia, who was 9 years old at the time of the story. After his passing, the weight of responsibility fell solely on Lauren's shoulders. She found herself drowning in bills, with very little savings to fall back on. Life, once filled with moments of joy and security, had become a constant struggle to survive. Lauren took a job as a dishwasher in Betty's Diner, a greasy, worn-down establishment on the outskirts of town, known for its 24-hour service and cheap food. The place had a reputation for being frequented by truckers passing through, and it was one of the few businesses that stayed open late into the night. Lauren worked the overnight shift, often starting at 10 p.m. and leaving at 6 a.m., her hands raw from scrubbing dishes, and her feet aching from standing on the cold tile floors. To keep up with her demanding work schedule, Lauren relied on her older brother, Marcus Freeman, a 38-year-old man who had moved back to Greenville after a string of failed ventures in larger cities. He lived alone in a rundown 2-bedroom house not far from Lauren's modest home. Marcus wasn't particularly responsible, but he had been close to Lauren growing up, and she trusted him to look after Mia during the long nights she spent at the diner. As months passed, Lauren began to notice unsettling changes in Mia's behavior. The once bubbly and talkative child started to withdraw into herself. Mia had always been a bright, curious girl, eager to share stories from school or ask endless questions about the world. But recently, she had become quiet, almost too quiet. She spent more time alone in her room and refused to talk about her day, especially about the time spent with her Uncle Marcus. It wasn't just the silence that worried Lauren, it was Mia's physical demeanor. The child seemed more tense, flinching at unexpected sounds or sudden movements. Her eyes, once filled with innocence, now seemed shadowed by something Lauren couldn't quite place. Mia had also stopped smiling, and her grades at school had dropped. Teachers mentioned that she no longer participated in class discussions and often appeared distracted. Lauren tried to confront Mia about what was bothering her. She would ask gentle questions at dinner or during the rare weekends they spent together, but Mia always deflected. "I'm fine, Mom," she'd say, her voice monotone, her eyes downcast. Every attempt Lauren made to reach her daughter emotionally seemed to hit a wall of silence and avoidance. Initially, Lauren thought it was simply the impact of David's death taking a delayed toll on her daughter. But as time wore on, she began to suspect there was more to Mia's behavior. The girl was no longer interested in the things that used to bring her joy, her friends, her hobbies, even the time they used to spend together. Something was wrong, and it gnawed at Lauren's conscience, but she couldn't figure out what it was. At times, Lauren considered if Marcus might know something, but she pushed the thought aside. He was her brother, after all. He had been there for her when David died, and despite his flaws, he had always seemed to care for Mia in his own way. But doubt lingered in the back of her mind. As the weeks passed, Lauren noticed small details that unsettled her further. Mia's reluctance to be left alone with Marcus grew more noticeable, though the girl never voiced it aloud. She would cling to Lauren when it was time for her mother to leave for the night shift, her hands gripping tightly to her mother's apron as if she were afraid. There were moments when Mia's eyes seemed to flicker with fear, but as soon as Lauren pressed, the child would withdraw again, locking herself in her room. Lauren's exhaustion from working nights only compounded her inability to investigate the situation further. By the time she returned home each morning, her body was too worn down to chase after answers, and she convinced herself that maybe Mia just needed more time. But deep down, the unease continued to grow. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening, something she couldn't yet see. Lauren Jacobs returned home earlier than usual one cold autumn night. It was just after 2 a.m., and Betty's Diner had closed unexpectedly due to a power outage in the area. As she pulled into her driveway, the house stood eerily quiet. Normally, at this hour, Lauren would find Marcus asleep on the couch in the living room, with the television flickering faintly in the background, but tonight the house felt off, too still. Lauren entered quietly, not wanting to wake anyone. She hung her jacket on the hook by the door and slipped out of her work shoes. Exhaustion weighed on her, but something nagged at the back of her mind, an odd sense of unease she couldn't shake. She peeked into Mia's bedroom to check on her daughter. Mia was sound asleep, her small frame curled up under the covers, her face illuminated by the dim glow of a night light. Satisfied that Mia was safe, Lauren made her way to the living room. Marcus was not on the couch as she expected. His jacket was tossed over the armchair, and his cell phone was lying on the coffee table, but there was no sign of him. Likely in the bathroom, she thought to herself. She sat down, her body aching from a long shift, and glanced at the phone. A message had popped up on the screen. Normally, Lauren wouldn't have cared, but something about the message, just a brief flash of the words, caught her eye. It was from a number she didn't recognize, and the message preview read, "Still have that video? Keep it private." Lauren's heart skipped a beat. What video? She hesitated for a moment, feeling a pang of guilt for even thinking about invading her brother's privacy. But curiosity quickly overpowered her reservations. Marcus wasn't nearby, and the phone was unlocked. She picked up the phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she navigated to the video gallery. There, she saw it, multiple video thumbnails, the most recent one dated just a few days ago. It was a short clip, only about 2 minutes long. The thumbnail alone sent a chill down her spine as she instantly recognized Mia in the frame. Lauren's pulse quickened as she pressed play. What she saw next left her paralyzed with horror. The video, grainy and poorly lit, showed Mia, her daughter, involved in something that Lauren could never have imagined. Marcus's voice could be heard faintly in the background, giving quiet instructions. Lauren's breath caught in her throat. The realization hit her like a freight train. Marcus had been abusing Mia. The scenes unfolding on the small screen were indisputable. It was worse than she could have ever feared. Her mind raced, her thoughts scattered. How long had this been going on? How had she not noticed? Every moment she had trusted Marcus to care for Mia replayed in her head, each instance now tainted with betrayal. The nausea rose in her stomach, and her vision blurred as tears welled up in her eyes. Her chest tightened, and she gasped for air, her body shaking with a mix of shock, rage, and helplessness. The phone slipped from her hand, falling onto the carpet with a dull thud. Lauren clutched her chest, her breathing becoming erratic. The room seemed to spin around her, and a sharp, stabbing pain shot through her body. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, her heart pounding violently. In that moment, Lauren felt her body give way under the overwhelming stress and the horror of what she had just witnessed. Her vision darkened as the pain intensified, and she knew, deep down, something was terribly wrong. She reached out instinctively, her hand searching for something to grasp onto, but there was nothing. The last thing she heard was the faint sound of the bathroom door opening. Marcus's footsteps grew louder, but Lauren could no longer move, no longer speak. Her body went still. Marcus entered the living room to find his sister lying on the floor, unconscious, her face pale, her hand still clutching at her chest. His phone lay next to her, the screen still illuminated with the paused video. His eyes widened in panic as he realized what had happened. But for Lauren, it was too late. The shock and the sudden heart attack had taken her life before she could tell anyone what she had discovered. After the sudden and tragic death of Lauren Jacobs, her 9-year-old daughter, Mia, found herself thrust into the care of her uncle, Marcus Freeman. The town of Greenville, Mississippi, quickly processed the paperwork, and Marcus, as the next of kin, was granted legal guardianship of Mia. The funeral came and went in a blur, with only a few neighbors and distant relatives attending. To the outside world, Marcus appeared to be a caring and concerned family member stepping up in a time of crisis. But behind closed doors, the reality was much darker. Mia, now without her mother, was left emotionally vulnerable, a young girl navigating the complexities of grief. Her father had been gone for years, and now, with Lauren's death, she had lost the only real source of stability in her life. She was too young to fully grasp the magnitude of the changes around her, and she had no one left to turn to except Marcus. As the months passed, Marcus began to further isolate Mia from the outside world. He pulled her out of extracurricular activities at school, claiming that she needed time to adjust and grieve. The neighbors noticed less and less of Mia, and those who did see her observed a quiet, withdrawn girl, far removed from the lively child she once had been. Mia's schoolwork began to suffer, her once bright enthusiasm for learning slowly dimming. Teachers occasionally inquired about her well-being, but Marcus always had a convenient explanation. She was grieving, he'd say, and it would take time. Inside Marcus's home, Mia's life took on a new and unsettling rhythm. The boundaries between uncle and niece had long been blurred by Marcus's manipulations, but with her mother now gone, Mia was completely under his control. She no longer questioned the inappropriate interactions that had been occurring for years. In her mind, Marcus had convinced her that their special relationship was not only normal but a sign of the unique bond they shared. Marcus would often refer to it as our secret, a phrase that held a heavy, ominous meaning for Mia. Over time, the repeated exposure to his manipulative tactics eroded her sense of right and wrong. To Mia, this was the life she knew, a distorted version of familial love, where she had no external point of reference to compare it to. Marcus, ever careful to maintain his facade, kept their interactions out of sight from the outside world. He explained to Mia that others wouldn't understand and that it was their responsibility to protect this special connection. As Mia grew older, her world became increasingly confined. Marcus limited her interactions with peers, encouraging her to spend most of her time at home, under his watchful eye. By the time she turned 12, Mia's perception of the world was deeply shaped by Marcus's influence. She had little contact with anyone outside their immediate household. Even her school life had been reduced to the bare minimum of attendance, with Marcus often keeping her home for days at a time, excusing her absences with claims of illness or emotional distress. Mia's development as a teenager was warped by this isolation. When she hit puberty, the natural changes she experienced were overshadowed by Marcus's ever-increasing control. He continued to reinforce the idea that their relationship was special, something that bonded them closer than most families. He framed his behavior as caring, even protective, ensuring Mia that he was the only person who truly understood her. By the time Mia turned 15, she was fully entrenched in the world Marcus had built for her. Any lingering doubts or feelings of discomfort had long been suppressed, replaced by the conditioning that Marcus had instilled in her since she was a child. She didn't question the interactions between them. In fact, she had grown to believe that this was how all close family relationships operated. The line between normalcy and abuse was so thoroughly blurred that Mia couldn't see it anymore. Her life was now a reflection of Marcus's control. She rarely saw friends, her education was neglected, and her interactions with the outside world were few and far between. At 15, she was a girl with no real understanding of what life could or should be outside of Marcus's influence. She had grown accustomed to his rules, his manipulation, and his version of love. In her mind, he was not just her uncle, but her protector, the only person she could rely on after her mother's death. Marcus, now emboldened by years of secrecy and manipulation, decided to take their relationship a step further. He began to discuss the idea of marriage with Mia, introducing it as the natural progression of their relationship. He framed it as something that would solidify their bond forever, a way to ensure that they would never be separated. Mia, having been so thoroughly conditioned by Marcus, saw no reason to question his intentions. To her, it made sense. He had been there for her when no one else was, and now, at 15, she believed that marrying Marcus was the next step in their special relationship. By the time the small, private wedding took place, Mia was fully convinced that this was her path in life. She had no one left to tell her otherwise, no external voices to challenge Marcus's narrative. The few people who might have questioned the situation, teachers, neighbors, had long ago stopped asking, accepting Marcus's explanations without suspicion. Mia had entered a new chapter in her life, completely unaware of how deeply she had been manipulated and controlled. To her, Marcus was still the only constant in her world, the person who had raised her since her mother's death. She didn't know that the life she was living was far from normal, far from right. To her, it was simply the only life she had ever known. After Marcus officially married Mia, a quiet ceremony witnessed by no more than a handful of people, life in their small house on the outskirts of Greenville seemed to return to its strange, unsettling routine. To the outside world, Marcus and Mia appeared to be an odd, reclusive couple, but nothing about their lives had raised enough suspicion to provoke serious inquiry. That was, until the arrival of a new neighbor. Ruth Stevens, a 40-year-old African-American woman, moved into the small bungalow next to Marcus and Mia's in the spring of 2013. Ruth was a warm, outgoing person who had lived in larger cities before deciding to settle in Greenville to be closer to her aging parents. She worked part-time at the local library and quickly became familiar with the small, tight-knit community. Ruth was observant, and it wasn't long before she started to notice peculiarities about her new neighbors. Mia, now 15, was an introverted, quiet girl. Ruth often saw her in the front yard, sitting alone or tending to the small garden Marcus had planted. At first glance, Mia appeared like any other teenager, but Ruth sensed something unusual. Mia rarely made eye contact with anyone, and she always seemed on edge, as if waiting for something or someone. Marcus, on the other hand, was distant. Ruth occasionally saw him leaving the house for work or errands, but he kept to himself. He rarely interacted with anyone in the neighborhood, except for the briefest of greetings. One afternoon, as Ruth was returning from the grocery store, she saw Mia sitting on the porch, staring blankly at the ground. There was something in Mia's demeanor, an isolation, a loneliness, that struck Ruth. She felt a strange pull to speak to the girl, sensing that Mia might need someone to talk to. Ruth approached cautiously, not wanting to alarm her. "Hey there, you must be Mia," Ruth said with a friendly smile. Mia looked up, her expression guarded, but she nodded. "I'm Ruth, your new neighbor," she continued. "I've been meaning to introduce myself." Mia didn't say much at first, but Ruth's warm, inviting presence eventually coaxed her into small talk. Over the next few weeks, Ruth made a habit of stopping by to chat with Mia whenever she saw her outside. Their conversations were brief at first, but little by little, Mia began to open up. There was an air of innocence about Mia, despite her being married to Marcus. She spoke of mundane things, like her garden or the books she read, but she never mentioned anything about friends, school, or hobbies typical of a girl her age. It was as if Mia's world consisted only of the house, Marcus, and the garden. Ruth found this odd but didn't push too hard. However, her suspicions grew stronger. Mia's demeanor wasn't just shy, it was as if she had been sheltered from the world, cut off from anything normal. Ruth could tell that Mia wasn't like other teenage girls. There was an underlying tension, a guardedness that seemed out of place for someone so young. As their conversations became more regular, Ruth gently probed, asking Mia about her life, her marriage, and her relationship with Marcus. One day, during one of their porch conversations, Mia casually mentioned her relationship with Marcus in a way that startled Ruth. "Marcus says we're special," Mia said, almost innocently. "He says no one else would understand what we have." Ruth froze for a moment, her heart sinking as she processed Mia's words. The way Mia spoke about Marcus wasn't the way a typical teenager would talk about her husband. There was no sense of partnership or romance, just a strange, almost childlike deference. Ruth asked a few more careful questions, trying to understand the dynamics of their relationship without alarming Mia. "He's been taking care of me for so long," Mia continued, her voice devoid of any real emotion. "He says I don't need anyone else." Alarm bells went off in Ruth's head. This wasn't normal. As the conversation progressed, Mia started to share more about her life with Marcus, things she thought were ordinary but left Ruth deeply disturbed. Mia described how Marcus had been caring for her since she was very young, explaining it as though this was the natural progression of family relationships. She didn't understand why Ruth seemed shocked or why her tone had suddenly shifted. Ruth, trying to keep her composure, realized the gravity of what Mia was saying. The girl had no concept of the abnormality or the illegality of her relationship with Marcus. She was trapped in a distorted reality, believing that what had happened to her was a normal part of growing up. Ruth knew she had to tread carefully. Mia had been manipulated for so long that she wouldn't immediately understand that she was a victim. Over the next few days, Ruth pieced together the horrifying truth from the snippets of conversation she had with Mia. It became clear that Mia had been groomed and conditioned by Marcus for years. He had isolated her, controlled her, and ultimately convinced her that their relationship was something special and acceptable. Mia's worldview was so warped that she didn't even recognize the abuse she had endured. Ruth felt sick to her stomach, but she knew she had to be smart about how she handled the situation. If she pushed Mia too hard or acted rashly, it might scare her away. And worse, if Marcus found out, Mia could be in even more danger. Ruth began thinking of ways to intervene without alarming Marcus, understanding that this was no longer just a neighborly concern, it was a criminal matter. Ruth's instincts told her that Mia's safety was in jeopardy, and it was only a matter of time before things escalated further. She couldn't allow this to continue, but she needed to gain Mia's trust completely before taking any drastic steps. In Ruth's mind, the only question now was how to rescue Mia from the grip of a man who had been manipulating her for years. Ruth Stevens knew she had to act. After weeks of subtle conversations with Mia, it became clear that the young girl was living in a deeply manipulated and abusive situation. Mia's inability to understand the true nature of her relationship with Marcus terrified Ruth. The girl had been groomed from such a young age that her entire perception of right and wrong had been distorted. Ruth couldn't stand by any longer. She needed to involve the authorities. But Ruth also knew that reporting this situation wouldn't be straightforward. Greenville, Mississippi, was a small town where everyone knew each other, and accusations like this could turn explosive quickly. She feared what might happen if Marcus discovered her suspicions before she could get Mia the help she desperately needed. If Marcus became aware that someone was onto him, Mia's safety could be at even greater risk. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Ruth made her decision. She drove to the local police station, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as she rehearsed what she was going to say. She had no concrete evidence, no physical proof beyond what Mia had told her in confidence, but she knew the police had to be alerted. This wasn't just a neighborly concern, it was a criminal matter that involved the systematic abuse of a child. At the station, she approached the front desk. The officer on duty, a gruff middle-aged man with a southern drawl, greeted her with a polite but detached expression. Ruth explained that she wanted to make a report of suspected abuse, but the more details she provided, the more serious the officer's expression became. When she mentioned the marriage between Marcus and Mia's age at the time, the officer's eyes narrowed with concern. "We'll need to look into this immediately," he said, jotting down notes as Ruth recounted the details of her interactions with Mia. "You did the right thing by coming forward. This is a serious matter." The wheels of an official investigation were set in motion. Law enforcement quickly launched a formal inquiry into Marcus's background and his relationship with Mia. Detectives were assigned to the case, and they began gathering evidence, starting with Mia's school records and family history. They noted the unusual circumstances of Mia's upbringing after Lauren's death and Marcus's sudden control over her life. Ruth's testimony was crucial in building the case. She provided details of her conversations with Mia, describing how the girl had been manipulated into believing that her relationship with Marcus was normal. Investigators were particularly disturbed by how isolated Mia had become over the years and how Marcus had gradually cut her off from any external influences. A few days after Ruth's report, law enforcement arrived at Marcus and Mia's house with a warrant. They knocked on the door, and Marcus answered, his face betraying no emotion. The officers explained that they were there to conduct an interview with both Marcus and Mia regarding an ongoing investigation. Marcus, though visibly tense, complied, but he watched the officers with a wary eye. The most crucial part of the investigation came when they sat down with Mia. She was brought into the local Child Protective Services office, away from Marcus's influence. At first, Mia was hesitant, confused by the sudden attention from the authorities. She had no idea that the life she had been living was wrong or illegal. To her, Marcus had been her only protector after her mother's death, and she struggled to understand why the police were asking so many questions about their relationship. The detectives approached Mia carefully. They had experience dealing with victims of manipulation and abuse, especially young ones who had been groomed for years. They started by asking Mia about her childhood and how her life had changed after her mother passed away. Slowly, they guided her into more sensitive topics, asking about Marcus and how he had cared for her. At first, Mia defended Marcus. She repeated the phrases he had drilled into her head for years, that they were special, that no one else could understand their bond. But as the questioning continued, the cracks in her story began to show. The detectives asked her about the wedding, about the nature of her relationship with Marcus. Mia hesitated. For the first time, she realized that the questions weren't about understanding their relationship, they were about questioning it. Tears welled up in Mia's eyes as she began to sense that something was terribly wrong. The detectives gently explained to her that what had happened was not her fault. They told her that Marcus had been lying to her for years, manipulating her into believing that the abuse she endured was normal. Mia, still in shock, struggled to comprehend what she was hearing. Her entire reality had been shattered in that moment. Meanwhile, the police searched Marcus's home for any additional evidence. They confiscated his computer and phone, looking for digital evidence of his abuse and manipulation of Mia. As the investigation unfolded, more disturbing details emerged. Text messages, emails, and other communications painted a picture of a man who had systematically groomed his niece for years, isolating her from any outside support and convincing her that their relationship was consensual and legitimate. The case quickly gained attention within the local community. News spread about the investigation, and while many were shocked, there were others who had always felt something was off about Marcus. As more evidence came to light, it became clear that Marcus had been careful to cover his tracks, but his control over Mia had left her completely dependent on him, making it easier for authorities to unravel his crimes. Mia's interview was the turning point. Once she began to realize that what had been done to her was wrong, she broke down, finally revealing the full extent of Marcus's control over her life. She described how he had manipulated her since she was a young girl, making her believe that no one else would care for her the way he did. The detectives listened carefully, understanding that Mia had been living in a prison of psychological manipulation for years. With Mia's testimony and the digital evidence from Marcus's devices, the case against him was solid. The police arrested Marcus, charging him with multiple counts of sexual abuse, child endangerment, and coercion. The town of Greenville was left reeling from the revelations, but the focus now shifted to Mia's recovery. Ruth, who had initiated the investigation, remained a constant source of support for Mia. While Mia struggled to adjust to the truth about her past, she now had people around her who were committed to helping her heal from the years of trauma and abuse she had endured. The investigation into Marcus Freeman's actions led to his swift arrest. With a mountain of evidence collected from his phone and computer, along with Mia's testimony, the police built a solid case against him. The legal system moved quickly, as the charges were serious: multiple counts of sexual abuse, child endangerment, and psychological coercion. Marcus had created a web of manipulation so deep that Mia, his niece and victim, had lived her entire adolescence under his control, unaware that the life she had been subjected to was far from normal. The trial began with Marcus appearing before a county judge in Greenville, Mississippi. Public interest in the case had grown significantly after news of the investigation broke, and local media covered the proceedings extensively. The town was stunned, many of its residents struggling to reconcile the quiet, reserved man they thought they knew with the predator he had been revealed to be. The courtroom was filled with a mix of reporters, community members, and a few distant relatives of Mia who had come to see justice served. The prosecution built a damning case, focusing on Marcus's long-term grooming of Mia, which had started shortly after her mother's death. They painted a picture of a man who had slowly, methodically isolated Mia from the world, keeping her dependent on him emotionally and physically. The evidence they presented was chilling: text messages, videos, and detailed records of the disturbing psychological manipulation Marcus had employed to convince Mia that their relationship was not only acceptable but something special. Mia's testimony was perhaps the most heart-wrenching moment of the trial. She had spent months in therapy since Marcus's arrest, slowly coming to terms with the fact that she had been a victim. Sitting in the witness box, her voice trembled as she recounted the years of control and abuse she had endured. She explained how Marcus had convinced her that their relationship was normal, how he had made her believe that no one else would understand their special bond. The courtroom listened in silence as Mia spoke, many attendees unable to contain their shock and sadness at the horrors she described. The defense tried to argue that Marcus believed he was protecting Mia and that their relationship was consensual, but this argument fell apart under the weight of the evidence. It was clear that Mia had been groomed from a young age, manipulated by someone who had taken advantage of her vulnerability and trust. The defense's attempt to shift blame or reduce Marcus's culpability only made their case weaker, as it was evident that Marcus had been fully aware of what he was doing. The trial lasted several days, and by the end, the jury had little doubt about Marcus's guilt. After just a few hours of deliberation, they returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. Marcus was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, ensuring that he would not be able to hurt anyone else, especially Mia, ever again. For Mia, the end of the trial marked the beginning of a long and painful process of healing. She had spent most of her life under Marcus's control, and now, for the first time, she was free, but that freedom came with its own challenges. Mia had to learn to live in a world that felt entirely foreign to her. Everything she had been taught about relationships, love, and trust had been a lie, and now she had to unlearn years of manipulation and deceit. Mia was placed under the care of social services, where she was surrounded by professionals trained to help victims of trauma and abuse. Her new guardians were kind, understanding people who provided Mia with a safe, structured environment. She began seeing a therapist regularly, someone who specialized in helping survivors of long-term psychological and emotional abuse. These sessions were difficult at first, as Mia struggled to open up and confront the full extent of what had happened to her. But over time, Mia began to understand that none of this had been her fault. She had been a child, manipulated by someone she trusted, and the shame and guilt she carried were not hers to bear. The therapy sessions helped her process the trauma, and slowly, she started to rebuild her sense of self. The recovery process was slow. There were moments of progress followed by setbacks, but Mia was determined to move forward. She no longer wanted to be defined by what Marcus had done to her. Throughout this difficult period, Ruth Stevens remained a constant in Mia's life. Ruth had been the one to intervene, to see what others had missed, and Mia came to view her as a lifeline. Ruth would visit regularly, offering support, encouragement, and sometimes just a listening ear. She never pushed Mia to talk about things before she was ready, but her presence provided a sense of stability and trust that Mia desperately needed. Ruth also helped Mia navigate the more practical aspects of her new life. She guided her through schoolwork, encouraged her to rediscover her interests, and introduced her to activities that allowed her to connect with others her age. Mia began to make friends, slowly at first, but each new relationship was a step toward reclaiming her independence and identity. She rediscovered her love for art and writing, talents that had been suppressed under Marcus's control. With Ruth's encouragement, Mia began to explore her creative side again, using drawing and journaling as ways to express her emotions. As months turned into years, Mia's progress became evident. While the trauma she endured would never completely disappear, she had learned how to cope with it, how to integrate her past into a future that was hers to shape. Her therapy sessions continued, but they became less about revisiting the pain and more about building a new foundation for her life. Mia started to dream again, about college, about moving away from Greenville, about a future where she could define her own path. By the time Mia turned 18, she had come a long way from the broken, manipulated girl she had been when Marcus was arrested. She was now a young woman with a strong sense of self, supported by people who genuinely cared for her. Ruth remained a close friend and mentor, someone who had helped her navigate the darkest moments of her life and who now stood beside her as she stepped into the future. Mia's journey wasn't over. Healing is never linear, but she had reclaimed her life, her voice, and her freedom. The justice system had held Marcus accountable, and Mia was finally able to begin a life on her own terms. It was a life she was determined to live fully, no longer under anyone's control, but free to make her own choices and build her own future.